Well, I want to show you a picture. 6 years ago tomorrow, I competed, I use that word loosely. I completed the Alamo Half Marathon in San Antonio, Texas with my brother. And as I look back on that moment, I think about the beauty of running by the Alamo, of running along the Riverwalk, of Christy, and I've got another picture of all of our fans wearing t-shirts, supporting my brother and me, supporting their dads and their uncle. And I think about just the experience of being there, going early and spending the night on the Riverwalk with our families together. My brother had flown down from Pennsylvania, and it was just this incredible feeling and experience. And as I look back on it, I'm pretty nostalgic about it. You know what I don't think a lot about when I think back, other than to tell you this? The hundreds of miles that I spent running hills in Austin, Texas, getting ready for that moment. The sweat that I lost, the shirts that I ruined because they were so stretched out and gross from all of the running. I didn't think about that. I didn't think about the shoes that I wore out. I didn't think about the blisters that I got. Because what do? When we look back on things, oftentimes we remember the good and we forget the bad. You do it too, okay? Some of you are like, man, the good old days of high school. Oh, college was the best. And you forget that you were broke. You forget that you were hungry half the time. You barely passed. Some of you squeezed 4 years into 7, and you're like, man, but those were the good old days. Some of you do it with vehicles. You're like, man, I remember the first car I had. It was amazing. You know, it had 4 on the floor and it had so much character. You forget that it had 4 on the floor and a hole in the floor. You forget that you had to beat the horn 7 times, slam the door, and say a prayer for it to start. You forget that you got stranded on the highway, right, in January in a snowstorm, but you're like, no, that car was sweet, the color, all of those things. Right? Because we're nostalgic by nature. We remember the good and we forget the bad. We do this with the Bible as well. We're midway through a series in the book of Acts. And if you've been a Jesus follower for some time and you've read through the Bible, oftentimes we say, man, we need to be like the church in Acts. And understandably, the church in Acts had some incredible things. Pastor Jared a couple of weeks ago talked about the fact that they were meeting daily, that they were meeting the needs of each other as they came up. We read that thousands of people were meeting Jesus, and they were all, and the Holy Spirit was working, and they were seeing miracles and all of these incredible things. But here's what I know. When we study the book of Acts, oftentimes we can remember the good and kind of miss the bad. We can be so fixated on the good. I mean, even as a pastor, at times I get insecure as I read the book of Acts because I'm like, they saw all those things. Like, why aren't we seeing those things? When I preach, 3,000 people don't rush to the front and say, how can we get saved? Like, we don't see those things. But here's the reality. Here's the truth. They were a messed up group of people just like you and just like me. They were. The early church had problems just like we have problems today in our church. So yes, we need to go back to the book of Acts, but also we need to understand that the church has never been perfect because it's made up of imperfect people, right? The church has always had faults because faulty people are a part of it. And that's both good news and I suppose bad news. But what that means for us is that there is hope. We may not be the church in Acts, but there's hope and there's opportunity. And I want to just say this real quick for free, that this is not a part of what I'm going to talk about today, but I imagine some of you perhaps have had a hard time at some point in your life finding a church because you've been looking for the perfect church. All right? The perfect church does not exist. It doesn't. I remember when we lived in Dayton for a little bit, there was a church there. It was the Dayton Vineyard Church, and their tagline was a pretty good church. I was like, I like that. All right, like at least they're owning it. Like we're a pretty good church. But that's the reality of things. Where there are people, there is brokenness. Where there are people, there is imperfection. And the church, with all of us imperfect people, right, has had things like internal politics that frustrate us. Leaders have let us down. Relationships have hurt us. In fact, let me just, for a second, with true compassion, I want to say some of you have been really hurt by the church. And I'm so sorry that has been your experience. I'm also really proud of you for being here, for trying church again in spite of your experience, which is a good practice to have. Because we shouldn't just say, well, if we had one bad church experience, they're all bad. A few years ago, my family and I, we were at Disney World and we stayed on property. And our first night there, we went to this dinner and it cost me like more money than I made in a year. And it wasn't a good experience. Can I tell you what I didn't do? Kids, come on, we're heading home. Disney's all bad. All right, we didn't do that. We stuck around, and my kids, if they could, they would go every year. They'd go twice a year, in spite of that one bad experience. And my fear for some of us is that that's almost what we can do with the church. But the reality is the church is broken because it's full of broken people. Any imperfections that you see in the church, this is important. It's super important to separate them from Jesus Christ. The imperfections in the church are the church's failure to reflect Jesus. That's why today, as a lot of people have left the church, they still would say, man, I believe in Jesus, I want to follow him, but his bride has hurt me too much. And the reality is, if you're around people, if you're in relationships, you're going to experience that. We're going to experience that. And that's what they see, and it happens in the book of Acts. So, Acts chapter 5, here's what's been going on throughout this book. They started strong, the church, as it was birthed. But then all of a sudden, things hit the fan. And it got bad, and it got bad real fast. The problems that they were dealing with then are the same problems that every church in America is dealing with today. Nothing new under the sun. Nothing new in that experience. And for them, here was a big part of what it was. They were becoming internally focused rather than externally motivated. They were becoming selfish both individually and collectively as well. They were more focused on what was happening in their own life and in their tight little community than those around them. And sometimes they were more concerned with what was happening in their family and then forgetting about those around them. And here's the reality. As a church, my prayer for us is that we never become so internally focused that we miss what's happening in our community. But the reality is, the more a young church grows, both in size and in age, the temptation is there to be more focused on the people that we're trying to keep rather than the people we are trying to reach. And when we do that as a church, we might as well close our doors because we've lost the mission that God has given us. Because we will be better at focusing on the people that we want to keep as we reach out together, as we have a mission to give our life towards. And that's the issue that they're seeing here, is that selfish, individually, collectively. Let me show you what I mean. Acts chapter 5. Verse 1, it says this: there was a certain man named Ananias who with his wife Sapphira sold some property. Now, why'd they sell the property? If you remember a few weeks ago, if you were here, Pastor Jared gave a sermon, he talked about this. They were selling their property not because they were communist, okay? They were selling their property to help meet needs for people in their community. And they would bring the money and they would lay it down at the apostles' feet. That they were so connected one another that they were going without to help others who were going without even more in that experience. But did you know, this is where the problem is. Did you know that you can do the right thing for the wrong reasons? You can. I remember I was in college and I had met this freshman girl. I was a junior, beautiful, blonde hair, blue eyes. And she said, hey, on Monday nights, I go to the nursing home. Do you want to come with me? I got to tell you, there was nothing in me that wanted to go to a nursing home. Like I had only bad experiences I could tell you about later from being in a nursing home. But you know what I said? I'd love to. And I went to that nursing home and I was the best bingo caller that they ever had. I was loud, I was proud. But can I tell you, I went for all the wrong reasons. And it's life, we can do the right thing for the wrong reasons. I ended up marrying her, so it worked out okay. At least for one of us. The other one you can talk to. But we can do the right things for the wrong reasons. And so what we see here, verse 2, it says, he brought this is Ananias, notice that part of the money to the apostles, claiming it was the full amount. With his wife's consent, he kept the rest. In the original language, that word kept the rest actually means embezzled. Interesting use of the word there. So you might say, well, it's his money. He can do what he wants. Well, it's God's money. But yes, he could do what he wanted. The problem wasn't that he kept some back. The problem was that he gave the impression that he gave it all. He was dishonest. His wife was deceptive, and it was a big deal. Verse 3, then Peter said, Ananias, why have you let Satan fill your heart? You lied to the Holy Spirit, and you kept some of the money for yourself. The property was yours to sell or not sell as you wish. In other words, you didn't even have to sell it, Ananias. And after selling it, the money was also yours to give away. How could you do a thing like this? You weren't lying to us, but to God. Strong words. In our culture, can I tell you what we would call this? A little white lie. We would call this my truth. We would call this an innocent lie because nobody has to know. I'm still giving 50% of my property. Nobody has to know. Nobody's gonna get hurt. We do that all the time when we justify things. Well, if I tell the truth, it's gonna hurt someone else. There's less hurt that will happen. It is never right to do wrong, ever. Like that's what integrity is. And parents, let me just say, our kids are watching us tell those little white lies. And guess what they're gonna do when they're 15, 16, 17, and 18? Right back at you. Same thing. And they're gonna have learned it from us. And that's what, so this is a big deal in the church. All right, it's a big deal. And so what happens? As soon as Ananias heard these words, he fell to the floor and died. I'm glad that doesn't happen when I've lied in the past. He fell to the floor and he died. Everyone who heard about it was terrified. Well, yeah, right? And you're probably like, that is really harsh. I thought God was a God of love, of mercy, of grace. Stay with me. All right, stay with me. Then some young men got up, wrapped him in a sheet, and took him out and buried him. That's pretty direct. About 3 hours later, his wife came in, not knowing what had happened. She's complicit in this as well. Peter asked her, was this the price your husband received for your land? Yeah, it was the price. Then Peter said, how could the two of you even think of conspiring to test the Spirit of the Lord like this? This young man who buried your husband, but the young men are at the door. They're going to carry you out too. Instantly, she fell to the floor and died. When the young men came in and saw that she was dead, they carried her out and they buried her beside her husband. Man. Now we say, why would a loving God do this? We're not exactly told why, but there's a couple things that we can kind of infer both from this passage and from the character of God. One is that God is holy. God is perfect. And so his character demands that he has to do something about sin, about the brokenness in the world that there is. Sometimes it might seem harsh. Sometimes it might seem loving. But nevertheless, his character demands he has to do something. But here's the second thing. Unity was such a big deal to God. If you've read through the Bible in John chapter 17, Jesus is praying one of the last prayers he prays before he goes to the cross and dies. And the thing that he actually prayed for is unity. He could have prayed for so many things. It was unity. And here's why. He said, I pray that the church is so unified that the outside world notices how unified they are and it makes a difference in their life. And you cannot have unity without trust, right? Because relationships move at the speed of trust. And so this was a big deal. Think about it this way. How likely was the next person to lie? It probably curbed the behavior a little bit. And we'll talk about that here in a second. But here's the thing. I want us to understand, if we only focus on what happened and why God chose to do this, we miss the thrust of this story. The question we've got to ask ourselves is, how did Ananias and Sapphira get to this place? Because I think we're not that far removed from them either. And their problem in all of this, I believe, is that they put themselves above others, above the community, above their relationship with God. And that was a big deal. They forgot it was not all about them, that they were responsible for their community and their community was responsible for them. And they certainly weren't the only imperfect people that were in the church. Okay, well, I understand that. But listen, let's just look at what happens here as a result of this. Verse 11, great fear gripped the entire church and everyone else who heard what had happened. Right? So fear is gripping people. Can I tell you, fear is a motivator. You're like, well, God should only use love to motivate us. Okay, parents, with your toddler, do you only use love when they're running for the street? Maybe the first time, but when they do it the second or the third or the fourth time, do you only use love or do you do a little bit of fear? Fear is a motivator, right? Those of us that drive, how many of us would be motivated to drive the speed limit just for the love of country? But how about the love of our wallets, right? The fact is, if we get hit in the wallet enough, it's going to slow us down. See, fear motivates. And the reality is that's not always a bad thing. It's why our body was given the ability to feel fear. Verse 14, listen to what happens. And perhaps this is why God chose to deal with them this way. All this ugliness is happening, yet more and more people believed and were brought to the Lord. Crowds of both men and women. What man meant for evil, God used for good. The church continues to grow because they dealt with this issue. Because people woke up to what God wanted them to do. I'll just be honest, this is a hard passage at times to work through. But yet it's so necessary for us as a young church to understand how important these concepts are. Now, Ananias and Sapphira, they weren't the only problem in the church. Let me continue. Verse 1 of Acts chapter 6. As the believers multiplied. Now, that phrase is a dream for any pastor because the math has changed. In the book of Acts, in the beginning, they were growing by addition. And all of a sudden, now they are growing by multiplication. That's the reason our church exists today, because they were able to multiply to the point where eventually the good news of Jesus came to North America. The math changed in this. It's a beautiful thing. This is why as a church, we want to plant churches that plant churches that plant churches, because this is how movements of God continue. It's through multiplying disciples. It's through multiplying leaders. It's through multiplying groups. It's through multiplying churches. And that's what they're experiencing. But it's not all rainbows and butterflies. It says there were rumblings of discontent in the church in Acts. The Greek-speaking believers complained about the Hebrew-speaking believers, saying their widows were being discriminated against in the daily distribution of food. That's another way of saying racism was alive and well. Favoritism. The Hebrew-speaking Jews were ripping off the Greek-speaking Jews because they didn't speak the same language, because they looked a little bit different, sounded a little bit different. And this was a big deal in the church, in the brokenness. And just like with Ananias and Sapphira, selfishness hurts the church. This should both challenge us and encourage us. Because even with all this brokenness, God's still working. But listen to what happens, verse 3. And so, brothers, select 7 men who are well respected and full of the Spirit and wisdom. We will give them this responsibility. Then we apostles can spend our time in prayer and teaching the word. So what comes out of this? They develop this intricate system for caring for the widows, caring for the needy, all of them, not just those who were of one race, of one creed, of one nationality. Verse 7, it says, so God's message, again, out of the brokenness comes beauty. God's message continued to spread. The number of believers greatly increased in Jerusalem, and many of the Jewish priests were converted too. Why? Because when the church is unselfish, unity is experienced and outsiders take notice. when the vulnerable are cared for, it's viewed differently. When insiders are loved, outsiders take notice. And that's what God intended for the church to do, to care for its own. This is why you hear us time after time saying, hey, you should get in a community group. Hey, get involved and do life with people. Because that's where you're going to find people to meet you at your lowest point, to care for you when you're desperate, to celebrate your great victories with you. That's where the example of Acts is going to be lived out best. It can't happen on a Sunday morning alone. We come, we sit side by side, we listen to a sermon, we worship. All of those things are important, but it can't be the be all to end all. We can't one another the way that we were created to if we're doing life alone. And that's why we push community groups in such a big way. And we've got them, they're meeting on so many nights of the week at different places all around multiple counties. And we would love to tell you how you can be a part of that. It will help you take that next step. But we see here that the church is caring for its own. And here's what I hope you don't miss. There's a thread that we've seen throughout this part of the book of Acts that we've read today. And there's two things that seem like they're at odds with each other. The church is imperfect, it's broken, it's jacked up, and God is moving, God is working, God is doing incredible things. And the reality is that's good news for us because that means there's hope for us. And you know that there's brokenness, right? Like some of you have tension in your community group already. Some of you feel like disappointment with leadership of people at the church. You've been let down. You've maybe felt like things were too political or things were just not what you wish they would be. Like if I have not let you down, just wait, I will, okay? I promise, that's one thing I can promise you. People are gonna let us down, and yet God works and God moves. As a church, preferences, we're not going to always get to experience the preferences we want. Some of us wish the music was louder. Some of us wish it was softer. Some of us wish the lights were brighter. Some of us wish it was darker. We have all of these different things. We wish we had a program for this or a thing for that. Like that's the reality. The church will always face that tension. And here's the way that we redeem it. How we respond to that tension, it's going to determine the impact that we're going to have. It's going to determine our church experience as individuals. It's going to impact how we see the church, but also how the community sees the church as well. And the question we've got to answer is, how do we respond to the problem of there being broken people in our church and in every church? If problems are inevitable, how do we redeem them? I believe it's about by saying 4 words over and over. Here's the 4 words. It's not about me. Say that with me, church. It's not about me. Turn to your neighbor and say, it's not about you. Do it. All right. Turn to your second favorite neighbor and tell them it's not about you. Yes. Right? Can I tell you, you're like, man, I'm so glad I came to church to learn that. That's so powerful. But guess what? In every single disagreement that you've had in your life, there's been one common denominator that would have solved the problem. If you step back and said, I know what the problem is. I'm not getting what I want. Think about how that would have fixed so many problems in your relationship. Well, I say it all the time, but she won't say it. But I know what the problem is. I'm not getting what I want. But you don't understand what it's like to live with him. But I know what the problem is. I'm not getting what I want. But when I go to church, I know what the problem is. I'm not getting what I want. And when we understand that it's not about me, man, the world opens up to us and it puts us in this place for God to work and move in incredible things. As your pastor, it's not about me. It's not about my preferences. It's not about what I want. It's not. It can't be. And it can't be about you either. When you show up to church, when I show up to church, do we show up to consume or to contribute? Do we show up to receive or to respond? Do we show up to gather or to give? That's a question we have to ask every time we walk into worship together that will impact our experience here. And it starts with framing up the reality that it's not about me and it's not about you. It's never been and it never will be. It's about our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, and bringing honor and glory to him, building bridges for others to do the same. The entire Bible, I love it. It's summed up this way: love God and love others. In fact, so much so that it says love others the way you love yourself. It's almost like Jesus knew that it would be easy for it to be about us. But it's not easy for it to not be about me. And that's the reality that's going to drive, that's going to carry us if we're going to really pour into those around us. I want to read a verse for you as we come towards the end of our service, and I want you just to hear these words. This verse is actually my prayer for my life. I want this to be so true of me. Philippians chapter 2, verse 3. It says this: don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Don't look out for your own interest, but take an interest in others too. You must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave, and he was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God, and he died a criminal's death on a cross. That's our example. Jesus Christ, the God of the universe, took on the form of a servant. That word is actually the lowest form of a servant that there is. And he came to do that because he loved us, but also to demonstrate for us how we can succeed in our relationships and bring honor and glory to him and make his name famous. Can I tell you, humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less often. In just a minute, we're going to sing a song of surrender, a song of confession. And as we do that, I invite you to ask God to search your heart, to look inside and see, are there some areas in our life where we've made it about us and not about him? And as he does that, this is a great opportunity to just confess it to God. Christy and I will be down front. If it's something that you want someone to pray with you or for you, we would love to be able to do that with you. And I imagine one day, hopefully not too soon,